All right, so I'll start with the intro and then I will jump straight. Hi, I'm Hallie Ortiz at the Sing Sing Prison Museum, and we are so glad that you are watching this book program with Professor Jerry Flores. The purpose of Sing Sing Prison Museum's book club is to share reading recommendations, thought-provoking discussion questions, and access to conversations with authors and journalists about the deep-reaching ecosystem within the criminal justice system. We hope that this program challenges you to imagine a more equitable criminal justice system and to take action towards building a more just society. And with that, I am pleased to introduce our guest, Professor Flores, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Toronto and author of Caught Up, Girls, Surveillance, and Wraparound Incarceration. Professor Flores specializes in studies of gender and crime, prison studies, and intersectionality of criminology, and studies of race and ethnicity. He received his PhD in sociology from the University of California at Santa Barbara. We are so honored that he is joining us today to talk about his work. All right, and with that, Professor Flores, please introduce yourself and your field of study.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and hindi ahe, as we say in my ancestral language. It's a pleasure to be here. So over the course of my life, I have studied the experiences of incarcerated individuals or criminal justice involved individuals, and particularly women and girls placed at risk. So I have, as you mentioned, a PhD in sociology, and most of the work that I do revolves around the study of crime, punishment, and how the criminal justice system in the United States and now in Canada and also in a few other parts of the world disproportionately affect women of color and young people of color as well. So it's a little bit about who I am. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
We're very glad that you can join us today. What influenced you to research this topic?
Yeah, so a couple of different things. I mean, I don't think I have a traditional academic background, or perhaps how we view individuals who are academics now are changing. So I grew up in a really working class, working poor Mexican enclave in Los Angeles, California. Both my mother and my father are Mexican immigrants. We're descendants of the Purepecha people from central Mexico and also the Cuyuteco people on my mother's side. And so, I think growing up as a young person, I felt like an outsider. I didn't feel like I particularly fit. I felt comfortable in my neighborhood, but when I left this neighborhood, I felt like people from the dominant group didn't really want me around. Police officers tended to not be super nice to me, and teachers, albeit well-intentioned teachers, didn't particularly approve of my presence in their classes. And so I think as I grew up, I started to find the words to name some of these feelings like alienation, a place of like not really belonging, like going back to my ancestral lands and kind of feeling like an outsider because I was wearing a Dodgers jersey and spoke English as well as Spanish, not really fitting in the American context as well because I wasn't, because I'm a visible person of color. And so I think seeing how police mistreated people in my community, seeing how teachers disregarded students who looked like me, and then also having a large portion of family members who were incarcerated in California state prisons, I think really kind of inspired me to find out more about the whys and the hows and the what's taking place here. And as a young person, I dropped out of high school. I ended up going to a continuation school where they sent sort of like all the bad kids, right? Like every neighborhood has one of these schools. I was a part of this school. It's called Options for Youth. But luckily there, I was able to benefit from small classroom sizes, teachers that were really compassionate, and I was able to kind of turn my life around. And I think as I started to gain the academic knowledge and to speak, to put words to my feelings, to put words to my experiences, I was able to say, hey, you know what? I'm not really content with the way things are happening right now. I want to do something about it. I also saw really young people that I grew up with, like one of my best friends, Marie, get pregnant at a really young age by a man that was substantially older than her. And, I saw the way women were treated in my neighborhood. I saw the way my mom would go to work, pregnant, walk home for an hour, and then keep on working at the house while some of the men in my family didn't do the same. So, as I started to learn about this, and I started to study with scholars who study intersectionality, like Nikki Jones, Victor Rios, and Denise Segura, Carla Shed, I got to understand the language of intersectionality and oppression. And then I got to apply all these things that I was knowing in this project that ended up becoming a book where I interviewed incarcerated young girls at a juvenile detention center in Southern California.
Thank you so much for giving that insight. On that note, can you explain more about what the book is about for those who haven't read it?
Yeah, of course. So the book, is titled Caught Up. And basically what it is a description of the experiences of young women, young Latinx girls or Latina girls as they go from home to detention centers to the larger educational system. So what I did was I basically spent 2 years hanging out with young incarcerated girls, asking them about their experiences, playing kickball, doing some tutoring, trying to share some life skills. And during this time, I was really only interested in the connection between schools and detention centers at the time. And the kind of research I do is called ethnography or field work. It's where you actually go, you talk to people, you do interviews, similar to what a reporter might do for a newspaper. And so when I was in this space, I started realizing that for these young women, a lot of their experiences at home were really heavily shaped by trauma. That came at the hands of family members, mothers, fathers, cousins, brothers, extended family members, and they faced what scholars will call gendered forms of oppression and violence that was specific to them being young women. So like psychological abuse, sexual abuse, all kinds of mistreatment. And then a lot of times these young people would run away to escape this mistreatment, would end up on the street, engaging in high-risk behavior like sex work, shoplifting, doing drugs and drinking. And a lot of this was really related to just kind of meeting their basic needs, trying to get 3 meals a day, trying to find somewhere safe to sleep. And then before you know it, they ended up coming into contact with the criminal justice system and then end up being incarcerated. And while they're locked up, they face a lot of these same issues. The violence they experienced at home and on the street doesn't go away. Now it turns into violence from corrections officers, unfortunately, at times for violence from other young people. And for every violent activity that they participate in, they end up spending more time behind bars. Right? Fast forward a bit to when they're released. I also did a little bit of work at a continuation school, alternative school that was connected to the jail. And here I found out that basically anytime these young people slip up because they're on probation, they would be returned to the detention center. And for these kids, unlike others, they're required to check in with probation officers regularly. There was criminal justice agents at their school all the time. They were obligated to engage in drug tests, sometimes without their will. And then more or less always ended up back behind bars. And then I try to end the book on a sort of a happy note where I showed the examples of 3 young people that were able to positively change their lives and 3 young people who really wanted to change their lives and just couldn't. And a lot of what really helps young people, especially young women, to do well is meeting their basic needs, having somewhere safe to sleep where they don't experience violence, having access to quality education, and giving them 3 meals a day in a place where they feel safe. And I think when you're able to do this, you're able to keep young people at home and outside of the criminal justice system. And so as a whole, that's kind of what I talk about in the book.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I read your book in college and it was just a very pivotal reading for me and my understanding. It was just really fundamental in my learning. I remember reading about how you said that a lot of survival strategies that these Latina women have end up being punished, such as running away from abusive foster situations or, stealing food. It's unfair. And that was just a very important reading to me, and it's carried on throughout. And so thank you so much for writing this book. It's very important to me. I'm very happy I get to talk to you today.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. And with that, we can go on to the next question, which is, what did the process of writing this book look like? How long did it take? Were there any challenges in writing this book?
Yeah, well, that's such a good question. So, I think the research part of it, the fieldwork part of it, where I was actively collecting data and going to talk to people, doing interviews and writing notes, took a little bit over 2 years. Sometimes about between 2 and 3 years, somewhere right there in the middle. And I think that I did that, and then sort of like writing this whole piece, like writing a first draft that was initially a dissertation, took me about another year, and then about a year-ish making changes and helping it become a book. But I think probably the most challenging part of all of this was the continued challenge, the continued guilt that I felt of like interviewing these young people, trying to do my best to help, talking to these individuals who were so much like me, were like from a similar neighborhood, similar cultural background, spoke the same languages that I did, and having to leave and go home and leave the detention center and knowing that I could do very, very little for them. So I did the best I could while I was there. I taught as many life skill courses, I tutored, I hung out on the holidays, I brought food, like I did everything that I could. But for me personally, it just didn't feel like enough. I felt like I was writing a book about these young people's lives and the tragedy that's involved, but like I wasn't doing enough and I wasn't doing very more. And I always sort of wondered what happened to them when they left the detention center. And so I think that as a whole, when you do this work, if you're a therapist, if you're a teacher, this is very, very emotionally tolling, hearing stories of trauma over and over again. And it also brushed up against my own personal trauma that I encountered growing up. So I think that emotional bit was really, really challenging. And I think that it helped me understand just how much women and girls go through on a daily basis, and how I think as a society, we've gone far afield. I think that we've forgotten, as my ancestors of Purepecha teach us, that without women, we have nothing. They are the ones that create life. They are the ones who should be making important decisions, and the ones that we should be deferring to. And I think that we have devalued the lives of women, and particularly women of color. So like a Black, Indigenous women of color, that we are completely okay mistreating them, treating them like this, treating them as if they're disposable. And then when they don't follow the rules, or when they break gendered expectations, when they don't behave in the ways that we stereotypically want girls to behave, like by being meek, by being obedient, not speaking back, not fighting back against abuse, we lock them up. And so I think that's always, for me personally, one of the biggest challenges. I'm a firm believer in, we have this information, we created this knowledge. What do we do now? What do you do to help the situation? And it's something that I always hold myself accountable for, like wanting to do more. And I think that perhaps was the biggest challenge. Don't get me wrong, writing is complex. The writing bit I always enjoyed, but I always wish that I could have just taken all of these young people and created a sanctuary where they could have just been happy, loving individuals. And I think that we know exactly, like people have been writing books about this for a long time. We know exactly what to give young women in order to help them be safe. It's time to fund programs to help this happen. And it's time to actually do something about it and stop mistreating women and start teaching young men and boys, not that boys will be boys, but the boys will be held accountable, and that we will treat women and girls with dignity and respect. And then again, without women, we have nothing. We wouldn't be here.
Thank you so much for that. That was a really powerful response. I felt myself tearing up at certain points. Yeah, thank you so much. How does incarceration affect women, especially Latina women, differently than other populations?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the nuances of incarceration. So, historically speaking, since women were incarcerated initially, kind of in the U.S. and North America as a whole, they oftentimes were incarcerated, and white women were assumed to have like mental health issues or some kind of psychological problems that would be on their control. They would oftentimes be housed temporarily until the community can find them a husband to marry. So, while incarcerated, they would be taught homemaking skills, like how to sew, how to cook, basically how to take care of children and how to take care of men. But as we know, men can take care of themselves, but this was a sort of predominant ideology back in the day. And then once more women of color started entering the criminal justice system, they were viewed as sort of inherently bad, as like, oh, how could you leave your kids behind? How could you do this crime? It's almost like they were doubly punished, one for violating expectations for women, and then one for being people of color. Like there was no sympathy for them. There was no, oh, they have mental health issues. It's like, these are bad women. They don't care about their kids. They don't care about their family. And that's why they're here. And conversely, white women, and the way that we see this happen also when like a white man engage in mass shootings, it's always like, they're a lone wolf, they have mental health issues. Instead of saying the truth, it's like, no, they're affiliated with white supremacist groups, they're part of neo-Nazi organizations, and they've been plotting their attacks for a long time. But this is the same thing that happens to to women. So again, white women are given all this empathy, all this like preferential treatment and programs. They're seen as being innocent or like victims of their circumstances, while women of color are seen as being completely responsible for what they've done. If they've been abused in the past, it's sort of like, well, that's their problem because they stayed with an abusive partner. They're given no sympathy, and so I think that's the general difference.
Definitely. And as you brought up the lone wolf, thing that's been mentioned in the media, the Buffalo shooting has happened a few
Yeah.
days ago, and it is popping up a lot recently.
Yeah. I'm 1 hour from Buffalo, so I go to Buffalo often for shopping, or it's that sort of thing, just to go to Niagara Falls, and it is tragic. It is so tragic that our society allows this 18-year-old who is, but for all intents and purposes, a child still developing. I don't know how we got so comfortable as a society teaching so much hate to white men, teaching them that they're teaching some of these individuals that all their worth is set up on the oppression of women, the oppression of people of color. And I think sometimes in society, it's easy to be like, it's easy for people in power to do that, because it's like, then you're not really mad at the actual people in power. You're not mad at rich people who don't want to pay you a living wage, or at an economic system like capitalism that's set up on having a bunch of people at the bottom and a few people on top. So it's easier to be like, no, these dark skinned people, this is what they're doing to you. They're taking this, they want to replace you. When in fact, we all know that people of color are not hurting people in the dominant group, right? As a whole, we tend to hurt other people who look like us, for better or for worse. So it is tragic, but again, we cannot assume that just because somebody's white, they have mental health issues, and just because someone's a person of color, they're a bad person. This young person in Buffalo obviously committed a crime, and yeah, he was like fed for a long time this like hateful rhetoric that should have been addressed, but they didn't. And I think this really shows a legacy of like of a historical gendered and racialized oppression in the U.S. You allow white domestic terrorists to flourish. You don't do anything about it. But when it comes to organizations like the Black Panthers, which we know with the COINTELPRO program, we're completely taken apart by the FBI. Or you have like Black Lives Matter activists who are surveilled and harassed by the police. So we see this racialized difference, and as I say, it's tragic. But when I'm in this business, it's nothing new. I'm not surprised, because I've seen this happening for a long time.
Definitely. And similarly, what steps can people take to support girls, such as the ones in your research right now?
Yeah, so I think by far, for girls and women placed at risk, we absolutely need to give them a safe place to stay. When girls run away, they often engage in sex work, or they engage in partnerships with men who are a lot older, simply for the fact that they need somewhere to stay. Not because they want to engage in these types of relationships, not because it makes them happy or because they find them pleasurable. They just need somewhere to stay. They don't want to sleep on the street. We need to be able to provide them safe housing, 3 meals a day, a quality education, and mental and physical health. This is what young people need to stay safe. It seems almost cliche or simplistic, but that's more or less all they need. And I think the tragic part here is that so many women of color, so many Black and brown women in the United States and in Canada and across the world, do not get their basic needs met. Additionally, they're mistreated at home, and this is when they leave in search of a better life. And almost all of them just end up in worse situations. And so they often feel like they can't go home because their parents don't want them back, or because things are worse there than they are on the streets. And so, we have, with like the continued defunding of like mental health facilities and shelters, basically individuals that end up on the street in abusive relationships, or they end up in the criminal justice system, which criminal justice agents, most of them are not trained as social workers. They also 100% don't know how to handle these situations, and in lots of ways it's really not their job. Police forces were never intended to be a de facto social safety net, but unfortunately these are the organizations that receive the most funding, right? In places like Toronto or New York City or Los Angeles, police budgets always increase. So they unfortunately inherit a lot of these issues, which is tragic. Yeah.
Absolutely. Are you researching anything right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I moved to Canada about 5 or 6 years ago at this point, like right as Donald Trump, sorry, it's my cat, right as Donald Trump was getting elected. I decided to move here with my family. So I have an 8-year-old and twins that are 6, and then a partner who's a special education teacher. And as I moved here, I began to wonder what are the experiences of women involved with the criminal justice system like here in Canada, right? So as I started to Google this issue, I began to find out a lot about this ongoing situation of missing and murdered Indigenous women here in Canada. Like thousands and thousands of Indigenous women have gone missing or been murdered, also in the United States and Mexico. And so what I did was I embarked in this kind of a 2-year ethnographic research project, similar to what I did before, where I interviewed Indigenous women placed at risk. And so, I sat in my office or sat in community centers and volunteered at various organizations and interviewed women, got to know them, got to go to different community events. And it's like it's tragically similar, the stories that I hear here compared to the ones that I heard back home. So Indigenous women leave their ancestral lands because of abuse, because of a lack of job opportunities, because of lack of clean drinking water. Hitchhike to big cities like Toronto or Edmonton or Vancouver or Montreal and attempt to find a better life in the city, only to realize that a lot of the organizations that are set up to help them there are not doing the job. But there's lots of Indigenous organizations that have been picking up the slack and trying to help Indigenous women, but are overwhelmed and underfunded, don't have enough resources to engage in all the work that's necessary. And then having these women sort of end up on the street again, engaging in sex work or living on the street or staying in abusive relationships because they need somewhere to stay. And I think the key difference here in Toronto is that the winters, the cold could be Arctic cold, like negative 30 degrees Celsius or colder in the evenings and at night. And Indigenous women have literally frozen to death on park benches because they have nowhere to go. And so the new project is about why women leave home, right? The multiple factors, how this is connected to historical forms of abuse and mistreatment, what happens when they get to Toronto, and then try to move on with their lives. And so it's eerily different, but I think an important story that we need to tell, and we need to continue to discuss the experiences of women of color involved in the criminal justice system.
Wow, that's such important research. Thank you so much for doing it. And like you said, it's tragic having to engage with that. So
yeah, it's heavy, but it's important work. We got to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for doing that work. So how can we support you in your work? Where can we find you and support you as you do this research?
Oof, that's a really complicated. Well, actually, it's not that complicated. I think if you're trying to support me, the first thing that you can do is reach out to women and girls in need in your community and try to help them, whether it's buying groceries, helping them babysits, doing what you can to help women in your lives, like not mistreating the women in your family, treating them with respect, trying to find local organizations that help women and volunteering there, or if you can, donate money. Talk to people who who are powerful stakeholders and tell them that we need to fund programs. We need women only, women specific shelters. They're going to keep women safe, that allow them to bring their children and pets if necessary. And I think that's a good starting point. And you could always reach out and send me an email. But I think in terms of me, like, we need more funding for these organizations, and we need to help the women and girls in our lives. And I think that's how you can help.
Absolutely. Thank you so much again for talking to us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Glad to be here.